Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this very important topic of race and racism and the effects that it has on youth of color, social, and emotional well-being. We're excited to have all of you here today. We're going to give it just one more minute to allow other people to come in into the webinar, and we'll get started. We'll get started at 12:01 promptly, and I will pass it over to Letitia Stewart to get us started this afternoon. Please also note that this training is being recorded. This webinar is being recorded, as well as being live streamed on social media. All participants will receive a copy of the recording for today's webinar. All right, Letitia Stewart, please get started.
Apologies for that. Yes, thank you so much. I gotta get used to the mute. Yes, so thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for the webinar that More Success Consulting and I Raise Girls and Boys International is hosting on race, racism, and its effects on youth of color. This is a very timely subject. As you can see what's going on in the world today. Unfortunately, it's something that, even though we're calling it timely, is something that's pretty much timeless. It's been going on for quite some time, race and racism in the United States, and the fact that it does have an impact on youth and families, and negatively, unfortunately. So we want to give some light, bring some light and awareness to this subject today through this really, hoping will be a very powerful shared discussion. So I would like to introduce, the webinar is being sponsored by, again, More Success Consulting Services and I Raise Girls and Boys International Corporation. So something a little bit about us. So More Success Partners works with young and established nonprofit business owners and executives, providing the business solutions and resources needed to meet your business needs and take your business to the next level. I Raise Girls and Boys International is a nonprofit based in New York City. To safeguard youth, restore the community from the inside out, raise the quality of life for minority children, families in the United States and beyond through its holistic programs. IRAISE really focuses and is committed to working with the whole child, so that includes all aspects that impact the child, including this subject today. So to start, I would like to introduce the wonderful president and founder of I Raise Girls and Boys International. Founder of I Raise Girls and Boys International, but president of More Success Consulting, Ms. Shaniqua Moore, who is truly taken her passion for working with young people and turned it into a career and a foundation that really we all can build upon. So she's truly devoted her entire career and life's work to serving those vulnerable and disadvantaged children all throughout New York City. And I know that she will continue doing so through her great work. Ms. Moore actually has a master's degree in social work. And so today, all of our presenters include Ms. Shaniqua Moore, myself, Letitia Stewart. I am the executive director at I Raise Girls and Boys International. Melinda Farrell, who is our clinical director at I Raise, and Sharon Baskin-Moon, who's a researcher working with I Raise Girls and Boys.
Thank you so much, Letitia, for that. I know that I'm hearing some people saying that there's some background music on Letitia's end, and we apologize for that.
Oh, I apologize.
Yeah, she'll be muted for the rest of the webinar, and I'll be taking over at this time. Thank you so much, Letitia, for that great introduction. So let's jump into the overview of our webinar today. The first thing that we'll be doing is laying a foundation, understanding the concepts of racism, as well as systemic racism. Secondly, we'll be going into the effects of racism, understanding how racism impacts the well-being of our youth. And then finally, we'll be discussing some solutions that you can implement within your organization, whether you are a mental health professional or an educator, or if you're just a parent that just needs more information about this subject. Hopefully the solutions will be helpful for you. So our objectives by the end of this webinar, you should be able to understand the concepts of race and racism. You should be able to identify the effects of racism on youth social and emotional well-being, and you should be able to develop some solutions to implement within your own agencies. So I thought it was really fitting to start off with this quote, and it really speaks to the fact that race is a really sensitive subject. It's a very sensitive topic, but it cannot be ignored. A lot of times I think when we dance around the elephant in the room, which is race, we think that we're avoiding it, when in fact, to not talk about race is to talk about race. So there's no way around it. There's no such thing as being colorblind. We have to be very just straightforward with the fact that race is an issue, and that it is something that we have to discuss and that we have to tackle. But the first thing to do is to acknowledge it. So let's jump into some core concepts. Let's lay the foundation here. We'll be talking about race, racism, and systemic racism. So understanding the concepts of race, before getting into understanding how race impacts youth, we really have to understand what race is. And so this segment is really to get each of you to understand and to have a sort of a base foundation of what is race and racism. So we know that race is a socio-political construct that's been used to group people and to be able to allocate resources of society based on that grouping. So we know that it's not biological, it's actually something that's social and political, and it's a construct. Racism, on the other hand, is a system, is fundamentally systemic, and it's also structural. So when we think about racism, sometimes we think of it as an event. It is not an event. Racism is actually a system, and it's structural. It's very complex. And then the idea of institutional racism. This is how racism shows up within our institutions, whether it be within an agency or within a school. It's also known as structural racism, and it shows up in all of our institutions throughout society. And then there's systemic racism. This is a system and a force that empowers and perpetually keeps racism and oppression and discrimination and white privilege alive. This really deals with our systems in society and how our systems are geared to continue pushing this whole system of race through our policies, through our practices, through culture, and through ideology. The biggest thing about systemic racism is it becomes normalized. So it's sort of a contract that we all buy into by default when we're born into this world. So, there are a lot of different people talking about whether racism exists in other parts of the world, and the answer is yes. Racism doesn't only exist in the US, it exists all over the world. And so it is normalized and it is widely accepted in and by society. So it's something that's really important to know. It takes a lot of awareness, which is where we are in our society, is bringing forward these issues to the forefront so that we are conscious and that we're aware of them. So now that we talked a little bit about the concepts of race, racism, and institutional racism, I want to dive more into how these concepts work together to impact youth of color. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how youth of color are impacted in terms of race and racism within their school experience. Knowing that our young people spend a lot of their time inside of school, it's important to know what these experiences are doing and what they look like for our kids. First thing I want to talk about is structural violence. The presence of structural violence within the school system and within the school environment, accompanied by daily micro stressors from hassles and harassment and assault, can be very traumatic for kids of color. So having that presence, the structural violence within schools, that in itself is very stressful for youth of color, and as well, it also leads to trauma in our kids. Then there's school race-related trauma. This is really, really big and really important. I see this a lot in my career, especially in the public school system. We're based in New York, but I know this issue is not just New York, it's really widespread. But school race-related trauma is very real for our youth of color. Race plays a major role in the climate of public schools. So for those of you that are educators, or those of you that work directly with the Department of Education, you may know exactly what I'm talking about. It really impacts the climate of our public schools. A lot of our kids of color are experiencing race-related trauma within the school because the school climate is producing a lot of trauma for kids of color. One of the reasons is because our school climate a lot of times are negative, and a negative school climate can produce a sense of powerlessness among students of color who feel like they're not able to challenge racism, nor gain administrative support to change it. There have been a lot of cases where kids have complained about feeling disrespected by teachers, complained about being treated differently because of being a child of color, and nothing has been done by school administrative. And so it's sort of that sense of powerlessness where kids feel like they can't do anything about it, and this is just the way it is. And education equity, this is really big. We know that our kids of color are already they're not faring well education-wise. And so they're really impacted when it comes to education equity. They don't have access to quality education, quality schools, quality resources, and textbooks. And this is really huge when it comes to the experience of the child of color in school. It really influences the kind of school that our kids of color are attending, the qualifications of the teacher, as well as suspension rates and the presence of school resources. And we'll talk more about what that looks like inside of the school. So essentially, the space that should serve as a safe haven for children and adolescents, which is the school environment, can serve as a daily stressor to their well-being. Actually, in a study by Fisher, Wallace, and Fenton in 2000, they found that half of the students of color in their study expressed feelings of distress from race-based trauma in school. So kids are feeling distress. They're feeling this when they're in school. And this is really what race-based trauma looks like. Students have revealed that school personnel, and I'm sure those of you that are on the webinar or watching this live can also attest to this, that students of color have revealed that school personnel have made them feel devalued and have treated them as if they were less intelligent and more dangerous. And this is the experience of students of color in school. So as you can see, the experience of kids of color is very different when they're in a school environment from their white peers. Obviously, there's a lot of race-based trauma going on right in the public school system and right in the education system. And if we're not conscious about looking at these things, we'll miss it and we won't be able to deal with the issue. Another concept that I want to talk about is multi-generational trauma. And I know we've probably heard this concept before, but really what multi-generational trauma is the fact that trauma has been passed down from generation to generation within the African-American community. And so many African-Americans are walking around with trauma, and this is really rooted in slavery. And so that same trauma from years of brutal slavery and violence have been passed down into the psyche of African Americans. And a lot of our kids are also exhibiting and showing symptoms of multi-generational trauma. One of the things that I want to mention is that kids of color have been historically separated from their families. So you think about back during slavery, during the slavery era, African American kids were taken away from their parents and sold into different plantations. They were separated from their parents and families. And this trauma, has resulted in being passed down from generation. What's really interesting is that the way African American youth were separated from their parents during slavery, we see really the same correlation today, where we see there is a huge a portion of African American youth that are in the child welfare system. And we see a disparity and a disproportionality of African American kids within child welfare. So they're placed in foster care and residential settings, juvenile prisons, and residential facilities away from their families. So it's that same idea of separation that African American youth are experiencing. Another thing that I want to bring your attention to is the fact that African American youth were forced into slave labor since from the era of slavery. And so as kids, and we don't really identify the experience of the African American slave youth. So when we think about slavery, many times we think of it in a context of the adult slave, but we don't think about it in a context of the child slave and what the child slave experience was. And really, it was very stunting to their development and to their well-being and to their psychological well-being as well. African American youth were forced into slave labor. They witnessed extreme acts of violence, including witnessing their parents and family members being brutally beaten and even killed. And so this exposure to these extreme forms of violence has resulted in trauma that still lives in the psyche of African American youth. This is what multi-generational trauma looks like. The other thing that I want to highlight is the fact that there is an idea or a sense of continued oppression. So where African American youth have been dealing with this same sense of racism and oppression and violence for so many years and centuries, it hasn't stopped. So sometimes we like to think of slavery as something in the past or just get over it, when the fact is there is still continued oppression. So we see this with police brutality, we see this with the outcomes of our youth, we see that systemic racism is very evident and overt within our society, and there is no way to just get over something that's still happening. So there's an idea of continued oppression. There's multi-generational trauma together. So we have multi-generational trauma, we have trauma from the past that's passed down, and then we have present day trauma. So essentially what happens to the life of the African American is they're experiencing multiple traumas throughout the trajectory of their life. The other big issue is that there is an absence of an opportunity to heal. So while there's these two forms of trauma that African American youth are dealing with, there's also a lack of availability of healing. So kids of color are not able to heal from these experiences. And part of the reason why is because we don't really have circles of healing for our kids of color to be able to express and tell their stories and to begin their journey of healing. So there's an absence of opportunity to heal, as well as there's also that absence of access to the benefits available in society. So these are the effects of multi-generational trauma. Now I want to talk a little bit about the idea of race, because I think this is really important to understand race and its effects on youth of color. So the idea of race, what it tells youth of color is that there's something wrong with me if I'm a youth of color. It also tells youth of color that I'm inferior and that Anglo individuals are superior. So these are the messages that our youth of color are decoding within their minds as they're going throughout life. Again, they're born into this. And so this is the social contract they have to accept by default, that they don't have a choice to say, I choose not to be born into being Black or being born to being a child of color. They're born into this, and this is what they have to accept. And so these are some of the ideas that our kids are dealing with. So really, to understand this, race is really a social construct. And I said this earlier, it's used by society to give power and benefit and privilege to certain groups of people based on physical characteristics. Race is an evolving social idea that was created to legitimize racial inequity and to protect white advantage. So it's really important to understand this as something that's not embedded within science. It's not proven to be a biological factor. It is in fact and indeed something that is social and political. And so this social construct of race, what it tells youth of color is that they are inferior, that they are violent, that they are dangerous, the fact that it's just the way it is and there's nothing I can do about it. It tells youth of color that it's okay to struggle and to have pain because it's supposed to be this way. And what's really interesting is that race and this idea of race, it really legalizes child trauma. So that's something that I really want you to take away, is that race legalizes trauma within children of color. So some of the effects of racism on the emotional well-being of kids is one, stress. Kids of color are facing high levels and high amounts of stress, and this stress is frequent. So they're facing these daily stressors, race-related stressors, every single day of their life. And they're sort of going throughout life with facing these same stressors, and they're very frequent, they're very high. What this does is it really leads to mental health issues as well as to other issues like behavioral. There's also the inferiority complex that youth of color have because of the stereotypes and the stigmas that society places on people of color. With youth of color, they actually, and they take that in. And so they take in those stereotypes. So when they hear that people of color or African Americans are violent, or they're dumb, they're stupid, or they're not deserving, they take in those stereotypes, they take in those stigmas, and what they do is they internalize it, and then what they do is they attach that to their identity. So it impacts their self-esteem, their self-worth, their self-image. A lot of youth of color don't feel capable, and they feel less than their white peers. And then obviously mental health. Youth of color are more prone to experiencing trauma as a result of systemic racism. One of the huge things is violent race-based crimes. So seeing police brutality, a lot of kids of color during the time when of this Black Lives Matter movement, especially with George Floyd and other people that have been murdered by the hands of police, a lot of youth of color were afraid to go outside. They were afraid to even see a police officer because they thought they were going to be next. I seen a video online that was really powerful where there was a black young male. He was about maybe 10 years old, and he was in his backyard dribbling a basketball. And he heard the siren of a cop car. He just heard the siren. And as soon as he heard it and seen the lights, he dropped his basketball and he ran inside. Just that trigger of seeing a police officer car triggered something in him, fear, and that sort of survival sense. And he was afraid as a young person of color, and he ran. And that was really sad to me, because to know that our kids are dealing with that level of fear and anxiety based on what they're seeing is it's really disturbing. And so, yes, these violent crimes are affecting youth. Yes, youth of color are internalizing this. They may think that they're in fact next to be discriminated against or hurt by the police or other authoritative figures. So looking at the effects of racism on social well-being, we know that the Black family or the African-American family, they're more prone to family dysfunction. They're more prone to residing in single-parent homes and facing poverty and other socioeconomic factors. So this is one of the effects that racism has on the family structure. There's also parental trauma. So African-American parents that are raising African-American children, they're dealing with their own trauma. So they're dealing with their own trauma from racism while raising kids that are dealing with trauma. So there's all this trauma going on in the family unit of the African American. And youth of color with parents of color, they're more likely to deal with parents that have trauma and live in high stressful home environments. And relationships, youth of color report issues of trust, issues with being close to friends and other people, so interpersonal skills and social skills. And because, again, the idea of multiple traumas, youth of color are less likely to have healthy relationships throughout the course of their life. So now I'm going to hand it over to Melinda Harrell, and she's going to dig more into the social emotional impact of racism on youth.
Good afternoon, everyone. So glad that you guys could join us. What I'm first going to speak about is the identity development. In general, individuals want to feel good about who they are. They want to feel empowered, valuable, and productive. Children and adolescents start this process with great influence from external forces and relationships. They look to a society predicated upon racism, which causes much confusion, doubt, fear, worry, low self-worth, anger, hatred for either self or others, and in some cases, both actually. I've seen a rise in anger towards others and a need to escape the feelings of powerlessness. Much of what Ms. Moore said could definitely be incorporated here, but as a mental health professional and seeing children one-on-one as well as with families, I have definitely seen an increase in feelings of anger and powerlessness. Children as young as 8 are both angry about the racism and what they're seeing. They're actually knowing by name George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other people who have been brutalized or murdered by police officers. And it's very, very difficult because, as Ms. Moore said, dealing with the parents and myself being an African American woman, and also recognizing the vicarious trauma that these children are dealing with, but having to also deal with that trauma yourself. And you still have to provide the service, and you still have to be able, for the parents, they still have to be parents. They still have to be productive members of society, because there are things that we want to teach our children to do, despite the oppression, despite what's going on here. Ms. Moore, do my next slide. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so, and that takes me into the lived experience. As I stated, unfortunately, most of the young people that I service have experienced racism, both personally and vicariously. Early in life, these youth are being sent messages that who they are is a problem. As Ms. Moore said earlier, so many of them just even as young as, I would say, school age, being able to identify certain things, they really are internalizing these signals that say that they're not good enough, that they're not worth it, that they're not valued, that they're not worth being protected, that they're not worth being treated a certain way. And unfortunately, this is fostering the belief that these life experiences will continue, unfortunately, to make them believe that life is going to be full of unfortunate, unfair, negative experiences. Can you imagine being a youth, being 5, 6, 7 years old, and not, even at that age, not really being taught that you are valuable, not really being taught that you are important, and then having things like television and, just interactions that family members have? Because when something happens in the family, as much as we try to protect our children from things, don't think that children don't understand. Don't think that children don't know that something is wrong. If there was an uncle who was there yesterday, but he hasn't been here since then, and then a month later, he's still not here. Children began to make the connection. One, as Ms. Moore stated, like, how can I really depend on these relationships? Are they going to be here? And then when they get to understanding some of the causes, which oftentimes in our environments are due to racism and violence, then it unfortunately just intensifies these feelings that they have. So here we see there's been a drastic increase, and this is from my own personal experience with the clients that I've been seeing before COVID, during the midst of, and even now. And especially since Joyce Floyd, Breonna Taylor, it has been I want to say that I have to be very careful of how I even deal with the trauma in that setting, because that's how intense it is. So I've seen a drastic increase in anger, like I said, in children as young as 8, 9 years old, being exposed to the news, as well as aforementioned experiences in terms of family members, vicarious racism and things of that nature. There's even been an increase in sadness, even again, at such ages as 8 or 9 years old. Many feel that allowing sadness to be predominant, though, is not productive. And that's when I come into what I said about finding that children are more angry now, because even as young as 8 or 9, I'm having children say to me, well, it doesn't really make sense for me to feel sad about it because there's nothing that I can do about it, but I can be angry. The unfortunate part is what they are seeing. They believe that the anger is going to fuel a change because, again, this is violence that they're seeing happen to their people. And in their minds, because the violence is taking place, because the discrimination is taking place, because the racism is taking place, and that is what they see is changing things, right? Because that changes the people that live in their homes. That changes the relationship that many of them have with their fathers, their mothers, because if they are no longer physically in the home, there's a change. So instead of being sad, I'm going to be angry. If I'm angry, then I can do something. However, I've also seen an increase in, yes, is somebody unmuted? Okay. And visible sadness. I'm seeing that many of the children are now suffering from anxiety, panic disorders, and some are even having forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The unfortunate part was I've seen this particularly so at this point with children between the ages of 8 and 12. That these children are literally having nightmares about the photos and the news that they've been seeing. And the nightmares are so vivid that these children actually present when talking about it as if they were physically there to see it happen. I see that this is having such an effect on children's ability to sleep, their ability to focus, even their ability to have a conversation. It's sometimes very difficult even for the children to put into words how they feel. Many of them are feeling unsafe, right? This is causing many to feel hypervigilant. Like I said, I had one said to me, well, basically I'm angry. And the question posed to me was, Ms. Harrell, who's going to protect me? Who's going to protect me? I have to be angry enough to stay on guard so that I'm prepared if something happens. I need to be able to defend myself. Next slide. Oh, okay. So I'm going to sum it up before we move to the next slide. So basically, in my workings with the children, and I work with children from ages 5 until well into adulthood. But what I am seeing with the African-American youth from the ages, I want to say 8 now until about 22, there is a grave sense of hypervigilance. There is a lot of anger. There is a dramatic increase in other depressive symptoms. I even had a young man say to me that he was having a conversation with one of his friends about something that had absolutely nothing to do with race or, anything to that nature. But he was so focused on it that he began to cry in the midst of a conversation about something that had nothing to do with racism, that had nothing to do with the brutality. But this is something that is so heavy on this young man's heart and mind every day, all day, that even in the midst of attempting to have regular social interaction with his friends, he is still struggling to deal with the effects of racism.
Thank you so much, Melinda. That was very powerful, just hearing how you've brought in your experience as a clinical director that provides social work and clinical services to youth of color in New York City. And to hear those stories are very saddening. And I'm sure many people that are on this webinar or watching live can also relate to what you're saying. So thank you so much, Melinda, for that. I'm going to pass it over now to Sharon, our researcher. She's going to give us some research-based effects of racism on the psychological impact of young people of color.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, you've already heard some really powerful firsthand experiences and lots of great information about the social emotional impacts of racism on youth. And I'm going to bring in the research perspective, which really confirms and supports a lot of the same themes we've been hearing about. There's been a number of studies across the sciences and social sciences addressing these same issues about self-esteem, mental health, self-identity, and so on. And these are really useful. They give us different perspectives, new questions, and new paths forward as we're thinking through these questions and some solutions. So yes, the first article I want to talk about, there's been a lot of research confirming the connections between racism and negative health outcomes in adults, but it's a bit more recent that we're seeing this same kind of research making those connections with children. I wanted to share this review from 2013 that gives an overview of the findings of 121 studies that look at the impacts of racial discrimination on children. Most of these studies here were conducted among children ages 12 to 18. African American, Hispanic, and Latinx and Asian populations were the most frequently included groups. And the authors here looked at 461 different types of associations. So in other words, 461 types of potential health-related outcomes that children could experience in relationship with racial discrimination. They found that mental health outcomes, especially depression, anxiety, negative self-esteem, were the most commonly reported, with statistically significant associations with racial discrimination found in 76% of the outcomes examined. So again, affirming that strong link between racism and mental health consequences in youth. There's also a strong negative association of 62% between racial discrimination and positive mental health outcomes, like resilience, self-worth, self-esteem, adaptation, and social functioning. So in other words, as racial discrimination increased, positive mental health outcomes decreased, 62%. Behavior problems like aggression, conduct problems were associated with racial discrimination in 69% of examined outcomes. And negative health-related behaviors like alcohol use, drug use, smoking were also examined, and 51% of those found a positive association with reported racial discrimination. So this just gives an overview of all of the different kinds of studies that have been done. And as you can already see, mental health, especially depression and anxiety, are huge areas for exploration. Just moving on to the next slide, please. Racial discrimination is a common and chronic stressor for African Americans. And as we've already heard a bit about parental trauma, there hasn't been as much exploration of that. So this piece here affirms other studies that have already shown racism is associated with higher levels of child depressive symptoms and a decrease in self-esteem and life satisfaction. But less is known about racial discrimination as a chronic stressor for African Americans in a family context, because stress, obviously, as we've talked about, affects the whole household. You know, if one person is stressed, everyone feels it. So this study looked at 401 adolescents and their caregivers in Chicago, and not surprisingly, children who were discriminated against experienced depressive symptoms, but also the primary givers' experiences with discrimination were linked with the child's symptoms of depression. So if the caregiver, the parent, the grandparent, whoever was stressed, depressed as a result of racism, that impacted the child. But it's important to note here that not all of the African Americans in the study, and in general as well, experienced depression the same way or at the same rate. And the authors looked at a few possible reasons for variation within this group. One factor they looked at was gender. So the primary caregivers who experienced stress from racial discrimination were especially linked to depressive symptoms in girls. And there's a number of potential reasons this could be, and they explore some possibilities, but for our purposes, it's important to just be attuned to that, whether you're a parent, a teacher, a caregiver, to be especially attentive if you're dealing with a girl child or a boy child. They might be differently impacted. Another thing to point out from the study is that the primary caregivers' experience of racial discrimination were related to youth depression symptoms in low-income households, but not in higher income households. And again, there's a number of reasons this could be. Perhaps higher income households were better able to afford resources to deal with depression and so on, but that needs to be explored further as well. Next slide, please. So this article here, the study from 2020, looks at the immediate and longer-term impacts of racial microaggressions on African Americans, which we've also heard a little bit about already. This study was done in a college setting, but I've included it because these kinds of racism and microaggression are present throughout the K through college education system, and there's a lot of information relevant to what we're talking about today. So here you can see the kinds of racial microaggressions that students experienced in this study, which are very relatable to children in other grades as well. Segregation, lack of representation, campus response to criminality, which we can also think about in terms of in other grades, in terms of juvenile delinquency and how punishment is dealt out, which I'll get to in the next article, cultural bias in courses, tokenism, and pressure to conform. There's evidence that racial microaggressions can impact how students of color feel that they fit in at an institution, and that in turn can impact their academic outcomes, like retention and graduation rates. So this lead author has argued that stress associated with racial microaggressions causes racially marginalized groups to experience various forms of mental, emotional, and physical strain. And this has been discussed as a racial battle fatigue. This kind of stress leads to a number of physical health symptoms, but also anxiety, frustration, mood swings, emotional and social withdrawal, insomnia, as we just heard about. Ultimately, altogether, these symptoms lead to a loss of self-confidence, a questioning of one's work and self-worth. It's also important to point out that students or anybody who's a recipient of racism and racial microaggressions aren't just helpless victims in all of this. Everyone is equipped with varying degrees of coping skills, which is how people understand and react to and reframe events as a way of avoiding some of these outcomes. So no one is predestined to get depression or insomnia or anxiety. Everyone has coping mechanisms within themselves, within their families, their communities, especially with racism over generations. There are ways that people have adapted over time. Nonetheless, these are heavy, intense stressors that can wear a person down, which is why the term racial battle fatigue is so useful. As a whole, this study showed that, as expected, students who experience more racial microaggressions experience less happiness overall, which fits with other research showing how microaggressions make underrepresented groups feel unwelcome or that they don't belong in a place, especially in school systems. And just going to add one more perspective on how racism can make groups, especially young people, feel unwelcome. This talks about the impacts of suspension. The next slide, please. There's been a lot written about the academic and behavioral consequences of out-of-school suspensions, but less about the unintended social and psychological consequences, which is the focus of this study here. And this is relevant to our conversation because Black students are suspended at much higher rates than students of other races. So this first statistic here, 20% of all public school students were suspended at least once by 2020, compared to 48% of Black male students in that same time period. And this is just one statistic. There are others confirming that Black girls are suspended, excuse me, at higher rates than white girls, and so on. But Black males are definitely the group that suffer most from this. Suspended students in this particular sample were more likely to be male, African American, economically disadvantaged, and have a reported disability. And there are a number of social emotional negative outcomes that can stem from this suspension that is differentially applied to Black youth. A strong negative event like a suspension can be a turning point for a teen, making them feel that they've made this transition from being a student to now being labeled a delinquent. So they're being excluded through suspension, and that's an important change of identity where they might start to accept this negative label, and that can lead to further delinquency if they start to feel, well, maybe I am a delinquent, and they start to lose hope in themselves. Relatedly, the stigmatization, which we heard a bit about before, can also occur as a result of the suspensions. And that labeling can happen whether it's real or imagined. They just need to believe that others have labeled them negatively for these social and psychological consequences to occur. So when students internalize their own others' negative thoughts about them, they start to devalue themselves, their own academic identity and ability. So the questioning and lowering of academic identities is also associated with suspension. And this kind of identity has to do with how students relate to statements like, I want to do well in school. Like, are they trying? Do they want to succeed? Finally, suspension, which is literally exclusion from the school, changes their routines and activities and eventually attitudes about school, especially their thoughts and feelings about relationships with adults in school. Suspension breaks down these social bonds and contributes to their mistrust of school authorities and their intentions, impacting their trust in school and ultimately changing their opportunity choices for the future and life choices for the future. And last slide, I just wanted to end on a bit more of a positive note, because this is all very heavy, depressing stuff. I found this other piece. This study looked at what learning behaviors best supported goal setting among a small group of African American junior high students. And I wanted to quickly share a quote from the findings. They're looking at ways that they could affirm identities among these African American students and help them better articulate what they wanted to do in the future. And this is part of the findings. High achieving Black youth value their racial ethnic identity and knowledge of Black history. The message for educators and school psychologists with the task of supporting Black child development should be that Black children who have knowledge of history and traditions that are positive and specific to their culture also have a sense of purpose and carry this sense into school. And one more slide, actually. This is sort of a call for participants. iRaise is working on a survey right now, and we're requesting youth to participate. We're doing a survey on the social emotional impacts of racism on youth. And if you are a youth between the ages of 12 and 19, or you know of anybody who would like to participate, youth of any race, we would love to have you, you or your child, join us. So my contact information is here. You can email me, Sharon, at the email address there. And also, if you have any questions about it's in New York City, and we're going to be focusing on other cities as well. So, and if you would like to participate, please email me and I can give you further information. Or if you have any questions on the articles referenced here, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
So apparently we're having some technical difficulties right now, but we are going to have, as a part of this panel, a discussion on some ways that we can help. Okay, it looks like we're up. We're up and running, Miss Moore. Okay, so she's going to be preparing. I would just like to offer to the parents, you know, who have children, who, you know, you've noticed some differences in their sleep patterns, you've noticed some differences in their behavior, you've noticed even some differences in their conversations, you know, as all of, unfortunately, all of these murders and the other forms of racism and discrimination have come forth, to just kind of leave the door open for the kids to be able to speak. I know that it's difficult as a parent, you know, to see your child hurting and to understand that really this is a situation where it's going to take so many of us to do something about it. It's not like one person can just come in and change the entire world. I get that we all need to come together to find a collective way, but I think that it's vitally important for the children to understand that there's an open door, you know, and parents, I know that it's a lot to carry as well, but the children need to know that they don't have to walk around with this all by themselves. And I know in some of our communities, you know, even seeking out mental health is taboo. But I would also encourage you, if you do have the health insurance and, you know, you can, even if your child is not initially being, you know, overtly different, but if you suspect that something is going on, you know, go on Psychology Today, you know, look for some therapists, make an appointment. Just let your kid have some place to go. Sometimes children can buck and fight against it, but when they get in the environment and they recognize that this is a one-on-one, this is just me and this person, and it's safe for me to be able to say what I need to say, sometimes it really does encourage them to let go of some of those burdens. It really does encourage them to become more verbal. It really does encourage them to, you know, to want to try to work on some internal ways to deal with what's going on. So I'm just, okay, are we good? So lastly, I just want to encourage you parents, you know, and I know coming from the African-American community, more often than not, you know, we look for people who look like us to relate to. There are a lot of us there. So go online, look for the help, and seek it out. And parents, do the same for yourself. Self-care is vitally important. I'm going to turn it back over into the hands of Ms. Moore.
Thank you so much. That was really, I love where you left off, especially when it relates to African Americans seeking therapy and help. It is very taboo within our communities, and a lot of times we think that if we seek mental health, that there's something wrong with us. When it doesn't mean that. It just means that we need some extra support and guidance to process and get through certain things in our life. And as humans, we're just going to struggle with things in life. So therapy is a very great resource for us that we really need to start utilizing. And as Melinda stated, there are therapists of color that you can actually, you know, connect with. So if you're worried that, oh, if I go to a Caucasian therapist, they're not going to understand the experience. Well, look, I'm a licensed social worker. Melinda's a licensed clinical social worker. There are more out there that look like us. If you feel like it's best to connect to someone that looks like you and understands the experience firsthand. So we're coming to the end of our webinar, but I'm going to talk about some solutions before we end, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions, we'll leave the last 15 minutes to answer them. You can just put it into the Q&A. Any questions for any of the panelists today, feel free to use a Q&A. Do not put it in a chat. Put it into the Q&A and submit it directly to the panelist. So some ways that we can sort of start thinking about solutions to addressing all of these things that we discussed at the webinar today is looking at ways to really understand the African-American young person experience and to really use racial-centered approaches to working with youth of color. one of the issues that that we have within our society is that we don't have enough approaches that are race-centered and that are racially sensitive. So a lot of times within agencies and nonprofits, we make the error and the mistake of using resources that are mainstream and that don't cater to the experience of the African American young person. So you want to make sure that you, as a mental health professional, educator, a person that works with young people, or a parent, that you understand overall this whole complex system of race and racism, and understand how that impacts the client that you're working directly with. One of the things that you can do is encourage open dialogue with the young person to really understand their story. And you don't have to be a therapist of color or a mental health professional of color or educator of color. It doesn't matter what background you are, you can still be active in addressing this issue of racism. You can really create a safe and welcoming, inclusive environment to talk to youth of color, to really understand their story. And to hear them out, to just listen, practice active listening, and hear what their stories are. Look for ways to help young people of color process race-based stress and trauma. Melinda mentioned something earlier. Sometimes this issue is so complex that it's hard to even articulate or get the words to express. So sometimes kids are so withdrawn and it's so internalized and they're so impacted that they don't have the words to even begin to talk. So you can help them process this through art, through STEM, through other ways that they can express themselves, or just through conversation. Circles of healing has been proven by research to be an effective form of intervention, especially as it relates to lived experiences. So creating circles of healing and therapy that helps youth cope with daily stressors and really to begin their journey of healing. Also encourage young people to advocate and to be a part civically of standing up and fighting against the system of racism, whether it's educating their peers, whether it's connecting to a local club, whether it's just knowing more about this issue of racism and really taking a stance of being active. So as I mentioned, circles of healing are very powerful forms of healing for youth of color, creating a safe and welcoming environment for kids to process, express themselves, and to be able to heal. Implementing race-centered approaches to working with young people, as I stated before. This is really interesting. Religion has also been shown to be a protective factor, according to research, to helping youth deal with stressors of racism. So it's been proven through research that religion is a protective factor. So kids that have religion or that are religious, they're more likely to have better outcomes when dealing with this issue of racism. Therapy for children to begin their journey of healing. This is also something, again, another resource for you. Finding a therapist for your child if you are a parent, and if you're a mental health professional, think of ways that you can include these conversations in your sessions with your clients. We know that as those of you that are clinicians or mental health professionals, empathy is very important. It's a powerful tool. Not being very careful with sympathy versus empathy, understanding that you're not feeling sorry for your client, but you're empathizing with their experience, even if you don't necessarily know what it feels like. You're connecting to their experience, to their emotion, and to their pain. And most of all, you're sincere and you're authentic, because our kids can tell when you're not. Mental health professionals and youth professionals, if you are watching or if you're on the line, these are some of our responsibilities. Number one, we have to address our own implicit bias and ideologies. Sometimes we want to jump and help, and we just want to fix the issue when we don't want to look inside. The first thing that we have to do is the internal work, and that's the hardest part of dealing with this. So when people come and they're like, how can I implement an anti-racist model in my organization? The first thing I tell leaders is that you have to deal with your own internal bias, because if you can't deal with you and your stuff, you're not going to be able to help anyone else deal with theirs. So address your own implicit bias. Educate yourself on this issue more. Identify racial-centered approaches and interventions. Don't just go to what is mainstream. So if you've been using mainstream therapy techniques, if you've been using mainstream interventions, I challenge you and I push you to go and research more. What are some racial centered approaches or interventions and tools that you can incorporate into your sessions when you're working with young people? Really educate yourself also on this. Become educated on ways race impacts your clients. Again, we right now, and this is the huge thing with DSM-5, we don't incorporate culture and race into understanding the development of where our clients are and how to help them. But really, race should always be incorporated. So always think of race and racism and how it's impacting your client. Most of all, don't be silent. I opened up with a quote stating that to not talk about race is to talk about race. There's no such thing as being colorblind. So don't be silent about the issue. Really, anti-racism, it really involves being active. So that means if you are a professional and you're in an agency, look at ways to challenge this issue. You may have to challenge some things that you're doing. And, you know, I sit on the board for the National Association of Social Workers, New York City chapter, and we had a really candid and authentic conversation as social work professionals. And we talked about the fact that sometimes as social workers, we can actually, in fact, be complicit with racism, with pushing the agenda of racism. And so be careful that you're not a tool of oppression and that you're not being used as a tool of oppression within your agency. Be active, stand out against it. If you are in a place to be able to change policies and practices, then I will encourage you to do so. Look at your policies and ways that you can change it so that it's anti-racist and that it's not, and again, that our policies are fair and it's looking at equity. So these are ways as mental health professionals that we can also be involved and address this issue as well. This really is our responsibility when we're working with young people. So I hope that that was insightful to you. I want to end on this quote, and that is, it's not enough to be aware of racism. So coming to webinars and trainings are great, but after this, there has to be the next step. There has to be an action step. You have to take this now that you've gotten the information, and I'm sure there are other webinars maybe that you're taking, is what's the next step that you're going to take to address this issue within your agency, within your community, pushing for legislation that's equitable, that's fair, to make sure that our youth of color get the experience in life that they deserve. So again, it's not enough to be aware. And you can't take a webinar or a training and then just become an anti-racist. Again, you have to do the internal work. It is really self-awareness. It's a journey, and there are a lot of ways that you can sort of start that journey to being self-aware of your own implicit bias and your own bias and ideologies, and really confronting that. And again, looking for ways to be able to help youth of color deal with the issue of racism. So we're at the end of our webinar. I want to open it up for Q&A in our last few minutes that we have together. So I'm going to check the Q&A box to see if there are any open questions. I don't see any open questions right now. So I'll give it about 1 minute. If anyone has any questions, I'm encouraging you to put it into the Q&A box. Don't put it into the chat box, put it into the Q&A box if there are any questions that you have. Okay. Not seeing any questions coming in yet. Not sure if any of the other panelists are seeing any questions. All right. I hope no questions is a good thing. So just know that we are here as a resource. So should you have any questions in the future and you want more information, we do teach other webinars on this. Oops, looks like there's a question that just came in. Oh, okay. So a question from Stephen Green is, how do we address 400 years of trauma? That is a huge, that's a huge question, Stephen, and I'm going to let Melinda jump in on that, and I see another question from Brian on that I'll answer right after. Do you think this process applied to people in the UK? Yeah, Brian, that's a great question. I'm going to let Melinda answer Steve's question. And then Brian, interestingly, the question you're asking is very interesting. I actually went to a conference with the mayor's office, his wife, the New York City Mayor de Blasio, his wife Shirlane, actually had a big conference on mental health. And in this conference, one of the commissioners from the UK was present, and she presented on how the same statistics of racism in the UK is prevalent as it is in the US. So there was a lot of research that this particular commissioner, and I don't remember her name, had did on racism within the UK. And interestingly, they have a whole task force in undoing systemic racism within England. And I thought that was commendable. So to answer your question, yes, this issue of racism, and many people ask this, is it just US based? The answer is no, it's not just in the US. We see similar research throughout other parts of the world, and UK especially has been one of those countries where we have seen very similar statistics, very similar to the US. So this issue is not just centered in the US. Brian, thank you for that question. And Stephen, Melinda, do you want to jump in on Stephen's questions from a clinical standpoint, addressing 400 years of trauma?
Yes, heavy question. That's what we're all trying to do, actually. I think the first thing, Stephen, is the fact that you recognize that there is over 400 years of trauma. And the other thing is to become educated about it. The true way to address it is to be able to identify the effects of it. Because as Ms. Moore even stated earlier, when you can identify the effects of it, you will see how those effects are still very much alive today. And so when you're able to see it, then you are able to, of course, with your clients, map out a plan. Map out a plan individually on how you're going to address it. But I mean, the first thing in addressing it is to identify what that trauma looks like. Once you identify what it looks like, then you know how to address it.
Yeah, I think that that was really great.
That's the just for now.
Yeah, and that's a really multi-layered question. Because there's so many ways to address it. There's the individual work that needs to happen. So there's healing that African Americans need to have themselves. They need that healing, that internal healing from the damage of the 400 years of slavery that we talked about, the multi-generational trauma that lives that lives within the psyche of African Americans. So it's addressing that in yourself and within African Americans. And then there's also looking at how do we address this systemically, right? So it's looking at our policies and our laws and looking at ways that we can adjust them so that our laws are equitable. And so that the idea of race is that social construct that has been so damaging for people of color, that we just completely eradicate and dismantle the system of racism. So it really involves anti-racist work. It's no one answer. It's very multi-layered because this issue is so complex, right? 400 years, that's a long time. That's 4 centuries, and it's still going on. So there's still continued oppression. So really it is multi-layered. It takes multiple approaches to dealing with this. I hope that was helpful to you, Stephen. And I see a question from Shahida asking, what methods of coping techniques can youth organizers practice to be emotionally safe when dealing with triggers during marches and protests? This is a great question. So if the young people are going to be participating within those marches, I would definitely have some kind of session beforehand where I would sit with the young people and explain to them what are some potential things that they may experience within this march. And I'm thinking about a personal experience where the March on Washington, D.C. that happened in August was a very historical march, really huge turnout, right in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And I actually took my daughter, my 8-year-old daughter, and I also took my niece. And before I went, I actually, I prepared them. And what I did was I talked about what was happening historically, what was going on. Because a lot of times our history is not really told the right way. And so I sort of gave them a little history lesson before that. And I also talked about what are some things they can potentially experience and how to sort of deal with that beforehand. So I think it's important, Shahida, if you're organizing marches with young people, that you have those kind of candid conversations with them so that they understand. And then I would always recommend a debriefing session. So after the march, I would definitely have an opportunity for those young people that were in that march to sit together and to debrief their experience. Debriefing is really important. So definitely a follow-up. So after maybe sitting down with them where they can process their experience, where they get an opportunity to ask questions and to leave their comments and their thoughts. I think that's really important. So a pre-session and then a debriefing session is what I would recommend. Not sure if any of the panelists wanted to jump in.
Sorry, I was trying to answer another one of Stephen's questions because I see we have a few and the time is short. I was trying to type it in. But I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of preparation. And we know that as it actually happens, there's a level that we can't be prepared for, right? Because the reality of it, when you're out there and you're marching and you're face to face with hatred and you're face to face with discrimination, it could be very different than what you prepare for. But I think the most important thing is helping young people to understand that even in that, they can have some power. They can have some power to continue to march despite all of that. So I think that you're right, Ms. Moore. It definitely would require a conversation beforehand.
And also making references to the fact that there were young people marching during the civil rights movement. If you think about like Ruby Bridges and how she was, African-American, very young student that was brave enough to go against segregation within the school system, and how she was spit on, yelled at, our kids were sprayed with hoses, dogs were loosed out on them during the civil rights era, and making some of those references to how brave our kids were back then. I think that would also give them some confidence in terms of what to expect, or not to expect, but what kids have done in the past. I have room for one more and then we have to close. So do you ladies see more schools addressing the mental health needs of Black boys?
That's the one I was answering.
I don't know, Melinda, do you want to answer that question?
Well, actually, I typed it in. I guess he can't see it. I was just saying that at this time, that's actually what iRaise is trying to do. We're trying to come into many of the schools in the inner city because we know that's a great need. I can say, though, from some of the meetings that Ms. Stewart and I have with the schools, they are very much aware that the issue is there. They are very much aware that there is a need. The unfortunate part is there's not a lot of resources. And I think that's what makes, iRaise, not to toot our own horn, but I think that's one of the things that makes iRaise great, that we're willing to come into the schools and we're willing to be that additional resource. We're willing to take up that mantle and deal with the young people on that level. So yes, I see that there is a need for it. Unfortunately, no, the need is not being met as best as it can be, but places, agencies like iRaise, we're here to try to fill in the gap there.
Thank you so much, Melinda. And these are great questions. We're out of time, but those that are mental health professionals and working with young people, advocates, social organizers, continue the good fight, continue fighting and being strong, be encouraged. We have a lot of work to do. It is certainly not easy. There are so many approaches and we need everyone involved and all feet on the ground to be able to really dismantle the system of racism. Thank you all for joining us. We do have some upcoming workshops. We have an anti-racist workplace workshop. If you want to know how some more step-by-step things that you can do to address it within your workplace, that will be October 21st. And then More Success will be offering some other workshops unrelated to Racism but COVID-19 Funding if you're a nonprofit and interested in learning more about it. We also have a nonprofit seminar coming up as well on the 14th of November. So again, thank you all so much for your time, and thank you for being here with us during this time to talk about this very sensitive and urgent issue. Wishing you all very safe and restful afternoon. Please be in touch and please stay connected. Thank you.